All right, so I just want to talk about the work a little, since this is an artist talk, and so I just thought I'd kind of give a bit of an overview of what is going on here. Purely in description, there's about 13 different spaces that are tied together in this exhibition. And each one I wanted to sort of imagine as exploring a different aspect of surveillance in some sense, but also I wanted them to be real spaces, or functional spaces at least. So we have a waiting room, which is the first room you probably came into, where you literally have to wait to get into the space. There's a door buzzer that goes it's random between about 30 seconds to 5 minutes, the door will open. And so I'm interested there in this idea of kind of waiting to be seen in a waiting room. There's a kind of clear sort of power dynamic or hierarchy in terms of who's on the other side of this door, so just in terms of surveillance, you sit there, you wait, you're observed, and you wait to be seen by somebody else. So that kind of idea of surveillance that can conceal or obstruct or delay and construct a kind of power relationship between two spaces is what's going on in there. In the psychology room, we are performing the Asch conformity test. The Asch conformity test is a classic psychology test which evaluates peer pressure. So the test has a number of subjects, all of whom, except for one, are actors, and they're shown a series of lines. So they have 3 lines of different length, and then they're shown another line on a piece of paper and they say which one is it, A, B, or C. And all the actors conform. They say it's A. Maybe they got it right, maybe they got it wrong. But the subject who's coming in, the question is that subject going to say what they really think, or are they just going to agree with everybody else? So John Campbell came in and we performed or staged that test with some of his students. And so now the idea is that when you sit down, you find yourself like the subject within that test. So again, it's like a slightly different aspect of surveillance. In this case, like psychology, where kind of a sense of being watched, a sense of being evaluated by your peers, potentially modifies your behavior in some sense. And of course, psychology as a form of kind of observing ourselves, observing what human beings are like, was something important there also. After that, we have the director's office, Eliza's office, which seemed important. It's on the same floor as the rest of the gallery, so it didn't seem to make sense to ignore it. So there are cameras in there which are programmed to only record when Eliza's in a meeting with somebody. So the idea being that it will always appear that she's in a meeting. So here we got like a slippage between the museum as a sort of administrative body and also the museum in terms of the exhibition. So trying to create a bit of slippage between the institution as a whole and the work that's in the show. So asking maybe where one ends and one begins is not so clear. And I'm kind of interested, again, thinking about these spaces as sort of part of an institution, possible spaces that could exist easily within F&M. And so Eliza's office kind of performs that role. Also, of course, being the director of a museum or the director of anything is kind of a sort of surveillance situation in terms of having a boss who's watching you, but also being the boss means that you're being constantly watched also. So this idea of authority and its tie-in with bi-directional surveillance was something that Eliza's office presents an opportunity for. And we've got the corridors. The corridors are all being filmed. When we were constructing the space, planning out with Russ and Ron, we really wanted kind of long corridors that give people a sense of, take a choice, you make a choice. You're going to go down a corridor, there's a door at the end, you're not quite sure what's going to be in there. But this idea that you're being sort of highly controlled in terms of where you can go in the space. And so it's kind of like a sort of architecture of surveillance in a way. And the corridors are the only non-panoramic images in the show. So this way we are looking to make it more sort of labyrinthine and bureaucratic, perhaps. There's a control room, which is the room which has three sets of monitors in. Early on, I was shown images from the public safety office on campus. They had a control room, and of course, surveillance systems typically have one, suggesting again a sort of hierarchy of observation, where you see that you're not yourself seen. And so, here we have the kind of panoptic, classic sort of Jeremy Bentham panopticon idea, the watchtower in the center. But I think especially nowadays with a large kind of proliferation of cell phones, you go down to the Occupy events, as soon as anything happened, everybody would be taking pictures of the police and whatnot and putting them on Facebook. There's kind of very much a sense of that watchtower being observed more successfully and strategically. So even our control room here has cameras in the middle, so nobody is immune from the surveillance gaze. Then we have our chapel, which is here. In the Duramat text, there's an interesting kind of perspective on God. It makes a distinction between a personal and an impersonal God, suggesting that on some level, personal God is really there to reassure us that we're being seen by at least somebody. Somebody cares about us, somebody's watching us, even if nobody else does. But in Duramat's view, God is really more of a kind of logical necessity when you think about surveillance. There must be something logically that is not seen, and for him that would be what God is. So having Susan come in and do the sermon, which repeats, the other screens are filled with, as much as possible, single individuals. So most of the systems, the surveillance systems in this project, ignore video where there's lots of people, which is why you're not on the screens right now. I'm going to try and keep it down to like one or maybe two faces. Let's try and compose something using the surveillance system that we have in place. So Susan came in and we had a really interesting discussion, and she wanted to kind of talk about God as a watcher, God watching over us, and I think she did a really great job putting that together. We have cameras in the computer lab, the innovation zone, in a different building. Definitely hope to install more cameras throughout campus, which did prove difficult due to some network limitations or so, some red tape. Something it was interesting, interacting with an institution and finding out which parts of the institution refused to be seen. So it was an interesting experience for sure. But the computer lab is useful in terms of perhaps its relationship that we can explore between surveillance and virtual spaces, the internet, email, webcam, social media, that kind of thing. Certainly open up interesting elements of surveillance. It's a library. We did some filming of the library. Thinking about libraries also as surveillance spaces, monitoring what you read, proposing what you should read, that kind of thing. There's a camera. We put a camera for a day in a dorm room with a student called Jack, who was very helpful. And I was interested also in a dorm room as a kind of refuge space that within an institution is nevertheless kind of highly regulated, systematized. And the dorm room, of course, as a private living space, especially kind of post-events at Rutgers, post-Jenny Cam, that kind of thing is kind of interesting. These kind of spaces often are brought into the public sphere through surveillance technology. So that seemed an important one to have also. The holding cell, the public safety, in the public safety office. Initially we weren't sure if there was one, and then we found out yes, there definitely was a holding cell. Kind of pushed hard enough, and then we managed to get a camera in there, which was interesting. Of course, you know, obviously it doesn't really need me to say much about how is holding cell tied in with surveillance. We did some filming in the dining room. The chapter in Dürrenmatt's novella, which the piece is kind of based around, involves a conversation over drinks between a logician and a filmmaker. So we needed a dining room location. And again, this perhaps gives further scope to explore, you know, social etiquette, surveillance in social spaces, being regulated by your peers and so on. And then the final space is the screen room, which is the large room over there. And here all the footage from the different camera feeds is brought together and converted into this kind of instruction-based narrative that uses Dürrenmatt's text. There's a countdown timer in there, there's controlled lighting, switches between viewing mode and surveillance mode. And so here, again, interested in watching as a kind of passive activity that actually involves multiple layers of being observed. Are we sitting properly? Are we behaving properly? Are we watching what we're told to watch, and so on? So the screening room obviously is about watching, and also has cameras in there which allow you to be watched yourself. So those are that's the kind of like construct, I guess. But also, you know, bringing all that together somewhat into a series of different contexts that come together into a narrative. The kind of collision of these different spaces is what constructs the complete narrative situation. So this piece is part of, I guess, the first of 4 exhibitions I'm doing this year, exploring surveillance. There's this one. There's one just opened in New York last week, which is, I guess, a single version. Just has a single set of cameras, a single set of monitors, but it uses Facebook status updates to overlay subtitles on people's faces, people. So the cameras detect people's age and gender, and then find a status update that matches the demographic of the person who's been captured. The 5 subtitles come together to tell a story, and whenever somebody new comes in, the story changes to adapt to the new demographic distribution across the 5 screens. Then in April, in Seattle, I'm doing a public art piece, which will be up for 2.5 years, and it has a row of 18 large screens on the facade of a gallery, with cameras around the area which are beaming sound at people as they pass by, and telling them stories that match their demographic, also derived from Facebook. And then the images we put on this grid of screens, and have kind of visual composition put together. Then in Toronto in September, I'm doing another piece for the Toronto International Film Festival, a Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art, which will have cameras, many sets of screens. Each set of screens will only be populated by people of specific demographics, which will make it look like the gallery is exclusively occupied by those people. So one might be, I don't know, 25-year-old males, one might be only people of a particular ethnicity, one might be only people wearing density of people around these different demographic distributions who will kind of build up over time, and we'll be using depth mapping so that we'll be able to have multiple people in space simultaneously despite being not there at the same time, so we'll sort of layer up. So this is my kind of like surveillance suite, if you like, and this is, this being here in Lancaster then is my first kind of piece of that, and having you know, over a month to put this thing together was really helpful, because you know, when I was in New York last week I had 2 days to install, so having this kind of amount of time to be able to develop something has been really excellent. So I should probably say something about Dürrenmatt. So Dürrenmatt's novella, The Assignment. the title of this piece comes from that book. There's a short, sort of 24-chapter novella. Each chapter is 1 sentence long. And the book is exploring many of the different elements that you see in this show. So one of the main characters is a psychiatrist whose wife has disappeared, potentially because he was monitoring her psychologically too much. And she has this diary entry that she leaves behind where she said, I am being observed. And it's unclear whether that means that she's complaining that she's being observed by her husband, or it means at last I'm being observed. So this kind of contradiction perhaps is very much kind of at the heart of where I come into surveillance from. I'm interested in ways in which, on one hand, the kind of institutional gaze, cameras on the sides of buildings and so on, gives us, a more kind of classic, traditional understanding of surveillance. We don't want to be seen, we want to avoid being seen by, the man, or whatever. Whereas, at the same time, we're freely engaging in forms of self-surveillance, YouTube, Facebook, that kind of thing, where we strategically decide when we want to be seen and when we want to just watch. If we post something on Facebook and nobody pays any attention to it, how does that make us feel? We want a whole bunch of likes. We want people to have seen this thing and acknowledge that, yes, we're important. So in Durham's book, lots of commentary on the need to be seen in order to feel a sense of meaningfulness. And some of the instructions that you see in the screening room play around with that. You need to be seen in order to be meaningful. And so this is kind of an interesting dichotomy that seems to be prevalent in how we're navigating our way through surveillance nowadays. It's not as simple as not avoiding being seen. It's also about strategically deciding and crafting our identities in relation to these proliferations of cameras. So the Durham novel is really sort of suitable. It became very suitable for this project because it was not just about being seen; it was about the watcher watching the watched. And so I came here, as Eliza said, and taught a class in which I had my students kind of prototype this project somewhat. We read the text, we figured out ways to work with the specific words in that text to kind of try and craft non-linear narratives. Essentially, I use my students as human algorithms, where they kind of speculate on the way of organizing these materials. They go out and film it. They go and piece the pieces of video back together. And what you see right here, with the videos being pieced together algorithmically and automatically, is essentially automating the kinds of things that they were doing in that class. So it's an interesting approach to narrative. Also, having Durham gives me a sort of narrative template, which is something I like to use in my work. Other pieces I've made projects that reconstruct Antonioni's blow-up from everyday goings-on in a city. I've made projects with Harold Pinter's play The Lover, in which people in a museum are paired together and become lovers in a play. So using narrative templates is a useful way of organizing lots of video data, and I think this has been an interesting one, because rather than just simply using the text kind of directly, I adapted it into a series of instructions. So if you look through the text from chapter 5, which is available at the front, you'll see that these instructions are not specifically in the text; they're simply adapted from them. So some reference to von Lambert, the psychiatrist, monitoring his wife becomes observe your spouse. They become sort of directives, which I think is a kind of really interesting way of approaching this, because this voiceover ends up sounding more like a kind of self-help tape or something like that, which again ties back into this psychology of being watched, or feeling like you need to conform in some kind of fashion. So that's what went on with that. Okay, so lastly then, my perspective on this work. I think it's definitely my most ambitious piece so far. Scale is huge. You probably have 1 kilometer of cables in here. Massive construction, lots of coding, so it's a huge amount of work. But being able to lay down these foundations, I think is going to allow me to deal with, it's going to be really useful for the future. Also, thinking about ways in which large-scale information sets can be presented, how to deal with things like simultaneity, how to deal with the relationship between subject and object, audience members in an exhibition space, how to deal with the relationship between people being watched and themselves watching, between people's identity as either exhibitionists or voyeurs. This kind of system really explores that, I think, in a fairly successful way. Also, of course, being in a white cube space here, and also in a college environment, I think opens up some interesting questions about institutional context and also institutional theatre. Like, to what extent we are performing and controlled by this kind of more general environment of being at Franklin and Marshall and here in the museum. So that's all I have to say.
I was in the screening room watching the images. I realized that the text was priming me to read the faces and read the intentions of those who were depicted. Are there different permutations that cycle through there? Is there a design to that?
Yeah, they do. So each version of each cycle of the video has the potential to be different, depending on whether new footage is being captured by the rest of the cameras. So they'll synchronize their folders on their local machines, which will go to the machine in there, and so potentially it can change. And also there's some permutations available for each piece of text, so they'll be matched up with not just a single location, potentially it will be different locations each time as well. So it should never be the same exactly twice. And yeah, so that interesting. Yeah. So yeah.
I thought that was just very powerful.
Yeah.
To see the same image come through and realize I'm looking at Dick Fluke and I'm assigning to him an entirely different motive than the last.
No, that's right. I mean, that's where the value of this with image and text comes together, which is not really necessarily a new thing in art at all. But I think when it's in the form of a series of instructions, and you've got these people kind of, not necessarily performing exactly. Most of the people are in there sort of like, what am I supposed to do kind of thing. And then there's a series of instructions. I think that kind of works together quite nicely, because it's a challenge. I mean, this is not really by design a narrative space, a museum. In fact, museums are typically by design neutral spaces. They call them white cube spaces, right? And so the idea is that you're not supposed to be the person on display. You're supposed to be watching. You're supposed to be looking at whatever's there, and camera, the gaze is not on you. But when the gaze becomes on the audience, then often they're not really doing anything. And this is an issue, I think, that I've dealt with in previous work, where people, I want to find narrative in the audience and the people in the museum, but they're not doing anything, so there's no narrative to be found. So bringing in that knowledge and combining it with a form of instructions, I think, gives me a way to get around that problem.